"They're ready for you, Doctor," Nurse Chastain said, as she stuck her head through the double doors. Dr. Clyde didn't look up from his wash sink, where he stood mentally preparing himself for the coming surgery. Dr. Clive, just docked with the nurses in his OR, started every surgery by reminding himself that he was the hand of God, sent to cure the sick and heal the living. He was God's instrument, and he must help those in need so that he might fulfill his purpose. He finished his cleansing ritual and stepped through the same double doors the nurse had just exited. The gleaming surgical suite was awash with men and women garbed for surgery. The nurse stepped forward, gowning and gloving Clive as he stepped closer to the table. The trays were laid out just so, the breather nearby, his patient prepped and ready. Clive took a moment to glance up at the theater seating around the top of the sunken operating room and saw Steiner and Merkel, along with a few curious onlookers, sitting and observing as he began. Then he cast his gaze still higher as he basked in the radiance that flowed down from God like manna from heaven, coming through the glass ceiling above the gallery. St. Mercus Hospital was one of the few hospitals in the country with an operating theater. The administration thought it was good for business, letting guests who desired witness surgeries beyond anything they could ever imagine. The tagline for the operating theater was, "Come see God's miracles daily," on the promotional materials, and Dr. Marcus Clive was the chief performer of those miracles. He made eye contact with Dr. Steiner and had to remind himself not to wink at him. He was above such baser gloating, even if it would really get Steiner's goat. He knew as well as Steiner did that it was a prestigious honor to operate here, an honor granted only to Clive these days. He had never had a surgical mishap, never lost a patient, and had no black marks to his name. They had called him a prodigy at Johns Hopkins, just like his father. Unlike his father, he had not been snared by the bottle or by the lust of the flesh. He kept a clear head and was a dutiful spouse, unlike his father. "Unlike Gwendolyn," the voice of the serpent whispered. He shook that voice off. That was the voice of darkness. What do we have today?" he asked Nurse Breacher. "Male, Mr. David Gross, here for an aortic valve replacement, Doctor." Clive smiled behind his mask as he held out his hands for the scalpel. He could have done this procedure in his sleep. "That was inspired, Doc. I don't think I've ever seen a replacement go that smoothly." Clive washed his hands, closing his eyes as he spoke the ending of his mantra. "I think Dr. Steiner stayed for the whole procedure." He could almost see Nurse Beecher's smile as she spoke. She was leaning against the scrub sink, Clive just finishing washing his hands. The washing was how it always began, and how it always ended. It cleansed him, made him clean before the eyes of God. He looked down as he washed, but had to look away and keep scrubbing. The blood was so thick there. He had wallowed in it, been stained by it. God's instruments are often hard to clean after they've served his purpose. Some of us are going out for drinks. I wanted to know, if you'd like to come with us. She twirled her fingers through her hair when she said it, looking like some high school girl trying to figure out if a boy liked her or not. Clive had seen her look at him like that for the last few years, and it always made him uncomfortable. If she desired him, then it would be best that she never say. He was a married man. She wanted too much of him. Who was she to try and test his bonds with Gwendolyn? Who was she to test the will of God's? Her hand felt warm on his when she covered it as she sat on the wash sink. "I know things have been hard for you, Doc, but they could be better. We could..." He shook his hand away. "I need to go." She turned away, hurt but not surprised. "Next time," she said hopefully. He knew that time would never come. Steiner was waiting by the elevator, almost as if he were waiting for Clive. "Great show today, Doc. Really, great show," he said, flashing that huge toothpaste commercial smile of his. Clive had always been unnerved by that smile. Steiner looked like a doctor from a soap opera. Swooped back blonde hair, chiseled jawline, body by Bowflex, crammed under a white coat. Many of the nurses lusted after him. Some of them had followed him to bed, but Clive had always felt uneasy around him. That mouth was too wide. his jaw threatening to unhinge like a snake when he talked. A mouth like that would swallow you whole, and he suspected that might be Steiner's plan for replacing him. Just swallow him whole, bones and all. Clive said nothing. He just pushed the down button as he prepared to leave for the day. "I talked to the board today, Clive. Mr. Mason doesn't think it's fair that you get to use the theater and no one else does." Mason's a godless fool, a Darwin worshipper who has no place inside these walls. Steiner smiled that too wide grin, and Clive had to stop himself from shuddering. "I'll be sure to tell him that." The door opened and Clive stepped inside, Steiner following after him. The door closed, locking the two of them inside this falling coffin. "Regardless, he's given me time in the theater next week. I've got a tricky bit of brain surgery that he thinks the public might like to see. It looks like you're not the star of the theater anymore." Clive scoffed, turning his stoic face into the oncoming leer. "I wish you well of it. May your efforts be to please and glorify God, and not simply to prop up your own damaged ego." His smile then became a real sneer. "That creepy, holier-than-thou-are bullcrap you spew isn't going to win you any favors here anymore. Daughtry and Morris are stepping down in a few months, and Simons will be gone by the end of the year. Clements is a weak-willed snail, and Mason will be free to move in some individuals with a less narrow outlook. Your days are numbered, Marcus." Clive didn't flinch from the sneer. Daniel never flinched within the lion's den, and certainly Steiner was no lion. He and Merkel could hover over him as he worked, but they'd gained nothing for their efforts. Clive was above the judgment of man. He answered only to God, and God's will would be done. "If that is the will of God, then I shall bow to it." Steiner scoffed. "You can use your God as a veil for your pompousness, but the rest of us can see what it really is. Pride cometh before a fall, Doc, and your fall will be long indeed from atop your high horse." When the doors opened, Steiner pushed past him and skulked out into the hospital at large. Clive let him get a dozen paces away before leaving for the parking garage. It was late afternoon, and the autumn leaves scuttled across the parking deck like skeletal rats. He walked through the rows of cars to the service elevator and took it down to the sub-basement. The maintenance men had looked at him like he was crazy when he'd asked them to put his spot down there, but Clive didn't want to park his BMW somewhere with high traffic. The car was his pride and joy, the first vehicle he had bought after becoming a doctor, and some days he felt like he loved it more than his wife. It was almost a decade old, but the chrome still shined, the paint was still immaculate, and the engine purred as if it had been the first day he'd driven it off the lot. The doors opened on the sub-basement, and Clive was pleased to see that his was the only vehicle here. He walked across the concrete tomb, one of the lights flickering overhead, and stood halfway to his car when he thought he heard the same skeletal scraping of leaves. He glanced around. Surely there were no leaves down here. No wind either, even if there were. He was 5 floors underground. The sound of his sensible shoes clocking on the pavement must have been what he heard. But as he started again, he stopped after hearing the same noise. It sounded strange in this place, but the noise sounded like laughter. Not real laughter. It was that false laughter that polite or rude people make sometimes. He had known people in his career who would laugh at any joke in just that way, if it came from the lips of a superior. It was false, a lie, and Clive had never stooped to such since becoming a man. He was still convinced that it must have been his shoes, the clump of his heels somehow making that sound as it bounced off the shadowy corners of the garage. But as he approached the car, he became less sure of it. As he approached his comfortable BMW, he could almost feel someone's eyes on him. That scuttling, skittering laughter blew like a wind across the pavement. He clicked the key fob as it got closer and closer, seeing the lights blink and hearing the cheery horn toot. He took a step towards the car, meaning to get in, then turned suddenly to confront whatever prankster thought they were funny. No one would scare him, whether it be in the light of day or the darkest tomb. He was God's instrument, an extension of his love and mercy, and he would not stand for being hounded by some cat's paw of Steiner's or Mercer or Mr. Mason himself. He turned and found no one behind him, just an empty garage and his uneasy breathing. He closed the door behind him as he climbed behind the wheel of his car. He felt comfortable behind the wheel. He felt in control again, and he pulled out his phone to check his messages before driving away. He had asked Gwendolyn if she intended to come to Mass with him tonight before going to wash for surgery. She hadn't gone to Wednesday Mass since the miscarriage. That had been a dark day for Clive, a dark day for both of them, but he had seen it as a sign that it wasn't time for him to have a child. When the time was right, God would bless him with one. Gwendolyn had taken it very differently, having a lapse of faith and a general stagnation of her relationship with God and the church. That had been a year ago, though, and it was time to get back in the Lord's good graces. It was time to stop all this dalliance and get back on the righteous path. Her response had been short. "Go without me. I have plans." Clive thought of asking who these plans were with. The gardener, her tennis coach, her fitness instructor, some stranger that she would drag into their marital bed to satisfy her lust. His fingers hovered over the buttons to do just that, but instead, he put the phone away and started the car. Gwendolyn would come back to the fold eventually. She would see the error of her ways, and he recoiled in his seat, his knees hitting the horn as his brain tried to make sense of what he had seen. There had been a face outside the window, an eyeless, inky black thing with grinning teeth and a too-wide mouth. That mouth reminded him a little of Steiner, and he felt his breath hitch in his throat as he looked back to confirm what was imprinted on his memory. It was gone, though, when he turned back. The only thing reflecting was his own haggard face. He shook his head. Maybe he'd been working too hard lately. Maybe all this was starting to catch up with him. Maybe it was time for a break, a chance to relax and reflect. He shook the thoughts away. God's instrument never rested. He pulled out of the parking garage and turned for St. Dominic's. He needed to bask in the glory of God before returning to the Sodom that his home had become. He arrived home just as the front door opened, and Gwendolyn walked out with her personal trainer. They were mooning at each other, hand in hand, and as they came onto the wide front porch, their hands slipped from each other's when they saw his car in the driveway. Clive had never bothered to learn the man's name. He was one in a long line of lovers that his wife had brought home over the past year. He didn't linger on the front porch. He said his goodbyes and was pulling out 30 seconds later. Clive prayed daily that that wasn't the only pulling out that he was doing. He also prayed that she was being safe, if not smart. She was waiting for him on the porch as he sat in his car. Clearly she wanted to talk, to put his mind at ease, that they were just friends, or he was just here for his session, or some other excuse. He looked in the rearview mirror to be sure the man had left, and cringed away before turning to look in the back seat. He was panting as he scanned the back, eyes darting like a scared animal. The thing from the garage had been there, had turned and grinned at him, but now there was... He jumped, hitting his head on the ceiling as someone knocked on the glass. It was Gwendolyn. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice muffled by the glass. "It looked like something startled you." He killed the engine and stepped out of the car, sending his wife stepping back so the door didn't hit her. "I'm fine. I see your plans went well." She followed in his wake as he walked towards the house, timid and unsure. "Randy came over for a private session, since it's hard for me to make it to the gym these days." Clive commented as he walked into the house. "You're home early," she said awkwardly, as the two of them stepped into the grand old house that had once been Clive's childhood home. "Service ended at 8. It's now 8:30. I'm home exactly when I should be," Clive said icily. "You're the one who's late in sending your plans home," was what he wanted to say. She had made him a cuckold, and all he could manage was passive aggression with her. He paused in the entryway, looking into the living room where his father's chair still sat. He had allowed her to redecorate every room except for this one, The couches, the old photos, that canary yellow rug his mother had loved so much, and of course, the tan leather chair that his father had sat in every evening and nursed his tumblers of whiskey. How many nights had he played on that awful rug, careful to avoid his father as he drank and read his medical journals? How many evenings had he come home from school to find his father right there and already drunk as he pretended he could see straight enough to read the Evening Post? He could almost see his father's ghost slumped in that chair now as it turned its head to regard him, its lips peeled back in a too-wide grin. Clive buried the shutter so Gwendolyn wouldn't see it and think less of him. "Are you hungry? I've got dinner ready if you'd like to eat with—" "Not tonight," he said as he gave her a pointed look. "Something's turned my stomach, I'm afraid. I'll be in my study." He walked across the hall, leaving her standing there like a guest who's unsure of where to go. He was operating. His scalpel was a gleaming silver sword as he cut the cheeks of his patient. He cut and cut and cut until the face was one long smile that grinned eternally, even as the patient groaned beyond the haze of anesthesia. He looked up when he was finished, raising his arm to the gallery and finding it filled with the eyeless, smiling creatures. They clapped and capered like Satan's imps, and when he drew off his surgical mask, he could see that he too had a wide, carved grin that dribbled blood onto the sterile floor of his theater. The monstrosities clapped and clapped, and their laughter rang out hollowly through the theater, devoid of all mirth or joy. They laughed without knowing joy, and he reveled in their regard. The thunder outside woke him suddenly, and he sat up in bed. He was breathing heavily, the dream having rattled him, and the rain had started coming down some time after he'd gone to bed. He had kissed Gwendolyn dutifully good night, and gone to what had once been his marital bed. Now he slept there alone, her banished to a guest room until she was ready to make herself clean before God and confess her sins before Father McCormick. She said she wouldn't. It was no one's business but hers and God's, and Clive had rejected her, frankly, secular outlook on what was a shameful practice. The lightning made him jump, and when he looked at the window, he nearly screamed. Outside was one of the grinning abominations, clawed hands splayed against the glass, and rain dripping down his eyeless face. Clive stared at it, his heart feeling ready to leap up out of his chest, and the creature stared eyelessly back at him. The two stood in silence for a count of 30, before a bright flash of lightning dispelled it. When his eyes adjusted, it was as though it had never been there. Clive looked a mess as he came into the hospital the next morning. His scrubs were immaculate as always, but he hadn't had time to press his lab coat. His graying hair sprang up in cowlicks, and he was jumpy after a night spent with the eyeless creatures gazing at him. Every time he had managed to doze off again, he found himself back in that demonic operating theater, the gallery full of those waiting ghouls. He smiled at them in the dream and reveled in their regard, but beneath that facade, he was screaming. He woke up screaming more than once. Gwendolyn never came to check on him. She had likely taken a sleep aid and was catatonic in her bed. He had slept through his 6 a.m. alarm, and when he had come awake with the sun beating on his face, he had thrown himself out of bed in a blind fury. Now it was 9, and he was hours late for his rounds. Nurse Breacher was coming out of the elevator as he was getting ready to go up, and she seemed relieved to see him. "Doc, thank God. We were getting worried about you. Your 10:15 has been moved up to 9:15. They need the operating room at noon for some procedure with Dr. Steiner. Did you know he's been given authorization to use the operating room?" Clive climbed into the elevator beside her and pushed the button going down instead of up. He said as much yesterday. Nurse Breacher looked at him out of the corner of her eye as the elevator rumbled to the ground floor where the operating rooms were. You don't look so good, Doc. Are you okay?" "I had a rough night," he said, stepping out of the doors as they came open. The last thing he wanted to do was step into that operating theater that he had spent most of last night in, but the room was his domain, and he'd be damned before he'd let Steiner or those faceless boogeymen take it from him. Those words would prove prophetic. He hung up his lab coat, telling Nurse Beecher to get everything ready for his gastric debridement, and set about washing his hands. He spoke the words as he always did, a prayer to God to make his hands steady and his mind clear. But the words were muddled as that canned laughter from those creatures swept across his mind. He tried to dispel them, tried to exorcise them from his thoughts, but they just wouldn't go. He felt himself begin to cry, his tears falling into the sink as the warm water and soap ran to join them. He had gotten control of himself by the time Nurse Beecher returned. "They're ready for you, Doc," she said. He strode into the operating room and cast his eyes skyward. But the day was overcast, and it appeared that there would be no transplendent manna from heaven today. His eyes fell upon the gallery instead, and he sucked in a nervous breath as he saw them. Not the creatures, of course, but Snyder and Merkel and their dear sainted Mr. Mason were all sitting up there with a handful of guests and staff on break. They sat on high like a jury from God, judging him, trying to catch him slipping. He straightened himself and set his mind to rights. God's instrument did not slip. He made sure the patient was ready, a 55-year-old with a GI tract full of tumors, and began his first incision. He had opened the chest cavity, the room as silent as a church, when someone in the gallery laughed. Clive paused, almost dropping his instrument had it not been for the textured surgical gloves he wore, and put it out of his mind. The second chortle was worse. It sounded like fake laughter, like sitcom laughter, like the sitcoms Gwendolyn watched in the den sometimes that never appealed to him. He called for silence in the operating room and was elbow deep in the patient's abdomen when he heard the second laugh, a mirthless chuckle that rolled through the gallery like a dead leaf that sent his nerves skittering. "I said quiet in the gallery. If anyone else makes noise, I would like them..." But that's when Nurse Beecher suddenly started laughing. The woman doubled over, her face pressing against the unconscious patient, and sprayed laughter as the gallery rumbled above him. He looked up then, getting ready to yell at them, administrators or not, but he dropped his instrument and gaped at the assembled crowd. Steiner, Merkel, Mason, and numerous others were laughing like loons as the dark creature sat patiently amongst them. One of the nurses, who had come on her break, suddenly leaned out over the rail and fell to the polished tiles below. She burst like an overripe fruit, dousing the machines and instruments in gore and sending the other nurses in the room into gales of laughter. Clive backed away, his breath hitching as their laughter became more and more mechanical. They lost that rosy laughter, their human mirth drained from them as they laughed their lives away. The laughter echoed off the walls, bouncing against the glass ceiling and ringing eerily throughout the operating theater. Clive put his hands to his ears, reminded of the time they had went to a mental hospital when he was in med school. The inmates had laughed just like that, laughing despite the horrors they lived in daily, and Clive had heard that laughter in his nightmares for weeks after. It was the laughter of the clinically insane. It was the laughter of those trapped in hell. Then the man on the table sat up, his guts spilling out as he chuckled and laughed, and Clive felt his bladder let loose as he turned to run. He made it to the wash-up room, his hip striking the sink and sending him spilling. But when he tried to push the door open, it wouldn't budge. He threw his body at it, his hip aching when he hit it, but the door would open for nothing. Clive finally slid down the unmoving portal and sat with his back to it, watching the shadows of those imps coming for him through the foggy glass of the doors beyond. He began to pray, hoping God would show him mercy. Maybe God even did. Who's to speculate on the merciful nature of God, after all?
Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague,
Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you think you might be able to handle just one more creepy tale, go ahead and click on one of the stories you can doubtlessly see appearing at the end of this one. If you're not subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button too. Maybe hit that bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If, like so many of my patrons, you decide you'd like to get your spooky a little bit earlier, why not come on down to Patreon and have a look at some of the great tiers that I have. My $5 tiers get their spooky a little early, and they have their name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I make. If you'd like a copy of my latest book, there's a link below to my Amazon profile. I've got mini books. I'm sure you'll find one that'll suit you there. I always recommend Stragview Stories, as it's the one I'm the most proud of. It contains a large collection of prison horror stories out of Stragview, the prison that I've made in the Georgia hills. So, if you'd like to have a look, come on down. Before we go, let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor, and thanks to Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being my Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.